The rain pounded the windshield as if the sky wanted to punish the earth. That night, Manuel Colón de la Vega could barely keep his eyes open after 14 hours of repairing engines that weren't even his. His hands smelled of grease, his pockets were empty, and his old red Tsuru made noises that any mechanic would recognize as a plea for mercy. But then he saw her, a drenched female figure standing next to a luxury car stranded on the shoulder of the road, desperately waving her hand as dozens of cars sped by without even slowing down. Manuel knew he had to keep going, that he didn't even have enough money for gas to get home, that his mother was waiting for him. However, something about that unknown woman made him hit the brakes. He didn't know that this simple gesture of kindness in the middle of the storm would change his life forever. The storm had begun 2 hours earlier, just as Manuel was closing the metal shutter of his workshop in the Morelos neighborhood, one of those areas where the streets have more potholes than pavement and where people know each other by their nicknames rather than their names. Manuel Colón de la Vega, 32 years old, with calloused hands and deferred dreams, had spent the entire day under the chassis of a 1979 minibus that refused to start. The owner, Don Jacinto, had promised to pay him on Friday, but Manuel knew that meant maybe next Friday or maybe never. That's how things worked in his world. He climbed into his 1992 Nissan Tsuru, its red color faded by the sun and poverty, with rust spots that looked like maps of countries he would never visit. The engine coughed before starting. As always, Manuel caressed the steering wheel with the tenderness one feels only for the things that accompany us in our worst battles. This Tsuru had belonged to his father, the only thing he had left him, besides debts and the trade of a mechanic. The road to his home in Nesa was practically empty because of the storm. The rain fell with such violence that it was almost impossible to see more than 3 meters ahead. The yellowish lights of his car barely penetrated the curtain of rain. Manuel turned on the radio, but all he heard was static. He turned off the radio and concentrated on keeping the Tsuru in its lane while thinking about the 300 pesos he needed for medicine for his mother, Doña Rosa, who had been battling diabetes for 3 months, with complications worsening every day. That's when he saw her. At first, he thought it was his imagination, a trick of the shadows and the rain. But no, there was a woman standing next to an elegant black car, completely soaked. With her arm raised in a desperate gesture, Manuel saw at least 5 cars drive by without even slowing down. The woman brought her hands to her face, and although Manuel couldn't see her clearly through the rain, he knew she was crying. He should keep going. That's what reason told him. He didn't have time. He didn't have money. He barely had enough gas to get home. His mother was waiting for him, but his hands were already turning the steering wheel toward the shoulder before his mind could protest. The Tsuru stopped with a screech of brakes that had needed replacing 6 months ago. Splashing muddy water, Manuel rolled down the rusty window that always got stuck halfway. The rain immediately poured in, wetting his face. The woman ran over, stumbling in her high heels, which were clearly not made for walking on wet asphalt. When she reached the window, Manuel could see her better in the dim light of his dashboard. She was a woman in her 40s, with fine features that the rain could not hide, dark hair plastered to her face, and a black tailored suit that must have cost more than 3 months of Manuel's salary. But what struck him most were her eyes, filled with genuine terror that pierced through the elegance of her appearance. "Please, please help me," she said in a broken voice, almost shouting to be heard over the noise of the storm. "My car broke down. My phone ran out of battery. I need to get to Angeles Hospital urgently. My mom had an accident. Please, I need—" She didn't finish the sentence. I am swallowed it. Manuel didn't think twice. "Get in, ma'am." Don, he said, reaching over to open the passenger door from the inside because the outside handle was broken. "I'll take you." The woman looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and relief so intense that Manuel felt a lump in his throat. She waded through the puddles around the car and climbed into the Tsuru, bringing with her a torrent of water that soaked the worn fabric seat. She closed the door with difficulty. Manuel had to tell her to lift it up a little so that the latch would engage. Thank you, thank you. You don't know how grateful I am," she repeated, shivering. Manuel didn't know if it was from the cold or her nerves. No one stopped. No one. She had been there for 20 minutes. "Don't worry, ma'am." Manuel started the Tsuru and got back on the road. The Angeles Hospital is about 40 minutes away in this rain, But we'll get there. Manuel accelerated as much as the old engine would allow. The Tsuru protested, but obeyed as it always did for the first 10 minutes. The woman said nothing more, just stared out the window with her hands clasped in her lap, squeezing them so hard that her knuckles had turned white. Manuel watched her out of the corner of his eye as he drove, even though she was soaked and distraught. That woman radiated a kind of class that he had only seen in movies or when a luxury car mistakenly entered his neighborhood. "What happened to your mother?" Manuel asked softly, more to fill the silence than out of curiosity. The woman turned to look at him, and Manuel noticed that she had honey-colored eyes, shining with held-back tears. "A taxi hit her this afternoon when she was crossing the street." Her voice broke. "She's 83 years old, sir. She's in intensive care. The doctors said she needed to see me, that maybe she couldn't finish." She covered her mouth with a trembling hand. Manuel felt his chest tighten. He thought of his own mother, Doña Rosa, waiting for him at home, and how she would feel if she received a call. "She'll be fine, ma'am," he said, not sure if he was lying or if he really believed it. "Mothers are strong, more than you think." She nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. It was then that she seemed to really notice where she was inside the Tsuru with its worn upholstery, the stickers of the Virgin of Guadalupe on the dashboard, the tools Manuel carried in the back seat because he had nowhere else to store them. You're a mechanic," she said, pointing to the wrenches and dirty overalls in the back seat. "Yes, ma'am." Manuel smiled slightly. "I have a little workshop on Morelos Street. Nothing fancy, but it keeps me going." "Where were you coming from?" she asked. "Work. I had to stay late because a van wouldn't cooperate." Manuel shrugged. "But hey, that's how it is. Sometimes cars are more stubborn than people." The woman watched him silently for a moment. Then she looked at Manuel's hands on the steering wheel, hands marked by years of hard work, with scars from hot metal burns and nails permanently stained with grease that no soap could completely remove. "And your family?" she asked softly. "I live with my mom," Manuel replied without taking his eyes off the road. "My dad died 8 years ago. He was a mechanic. He taught me everything I know. My mom is sick, she has diabetes, but we're getting by." "Do you have children?" The question sounded almost shy. "No, ma'am, I never got married." Manuel let out a short laugh. "When you work from sunrise to sunset, you barely have time to sleep, let alone fall in love." A comfortable silence settled between them, interrupted only by the constant pounding of the rain and the rhythmic squeaking of the windshield wipers, which should have been replaced long ago. Manuel noticed that the woman was still shivering. "There's a jacket in the back seat," he said. "It's a little greasy, but you can use it if you're cold." She turned and took the worn denim jacket. She put it on her shoulders without caring about the stains. Manuel saw her close her eyes for a moment, as if that simple gesture of warmth gave her unexpected relief. "I don't even know your name," she said suddenly. "And you're helping me as if I were family." "Manuel," he replied. "Manuel Colón de la Vega, at your service." "Julia," she said quietly. Julia Echeverria and Ignacio continued in silence. The storm did not let up. Manuel had to slow down when water began to accumulate in some parts of the road. The Tsuru moved forward with determination, as if it understood the urgency of the moment. They passed other stranded cars, a sign that not all vehicles had the endurance of that old Nissan that refused to die. "Why did you stop?" Julia asked suddenly. "Everyone else just drove by." Manuel thought about his answer for a moment. "My dad always said you never know when you're going to need someone to stop for you." Manuel gripped the steering wheel. Besides, he couldn't leave her there alone. Mrs. Julia wouldn't be okay. Julia looked at him with an intensity that Manuel felt even without turning to look at her. "There are very few people like you in this world, Manuel." Her voice sounded different now, charged with something he couldn't identify. Manuel just shrugged, uncomfortable with the compliment. "I'm just doing what anyone should do." "But they don't," Julia replied firmly. "They don't." The rest of the journey passed in thoughtful silence. Manuel navigated the flooded streets with the skill of someone who knows every pothole and every curve. Finally, the lights of Angeles Hospital appeared through the curtain of rain like a beacon in the middle of the storm. Manuel parked at the emergency room entrance. Julia already had her hand on the door handle when she turned to him. Her eyes were filled with tears again, but this time it was something different. Not just fear, but also deep gratitude. I don't know how to thank you, Manuel, she said in a trembling voice. I don't have any money here. Oh, I don't have my bag. Everything's in my car. But if you give me your number or your address, I don't need anything, Mrs. Julia. Manuel smiled with that genuine warmth that only people who know poverty have. But they haven't lost their humanity. Just go to your mom. That's what's important. Julia looked at him as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. She took off her denim jacket and gave it back to him. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for restoring my faith in good people. She got out of the suru and ran through the rain toward the automatic doors of the hospital. Before entering, she turned around one last time. Manuel raised his hand in farewell. She did the same and then disappeared into the brightly lit building. Manuel sat in the suru for a moment, watching the rain hit the windshield. He looked at the gas gauge, which was almost empty, and sighed. He would barely make it home. But it didn't matter. He had done the right thing. That was what counted. He started the engine and set off on his way back, unaware that those 30 minutes with a stranger in the middle of a storm had just changed the course of his life forever. 5 days passed, 5 days in which Manuel did not think about Julia Echeverria Ignacio again, because his own life was falling apart so quickly that he had no time to remember past acts of kindness. On Monday, the owner of the land where his workshop was located, Mr. Ramirez, a man with a beer belly and a heart of stone, arrived with a smile that did not bode well. Manuel, compadre, he said with that false familiarity used by those who are about to stab you in the back. I need to talk to you. Manuel was under an '85 Chevy changing the oil. When he heard those words that made his blood run cold, he rolled out on his dolly, wiping his hands on a rag that no longer distinguished between color and grime. Tell me, Mr. Ramirez, look, you know I've always been patient with you, the man began, and Manuel knew exactly what was coming. But you're already 3 months behind on the rent. I can't wait any longer. I'll give you a week to pay me everything you owe, or I'll have to rent the place to someone else. Manuel felt the floor open up beneath his feet. Mr. Ramirez, you know how things are. There are hardly any customers, but I swear 1 week, Manuel, the man interrupted him, his voice now devoid of any trace of false cordiality. It's 15,000 pesos. Either you pay me or I want this place empty by next Monday. 15,000 pesos. For Manuel, it was like asking him to move a mountain with his bare hands. He stood there watching as Mr. Ramirez drove away in his brand new truck, leaving behind a cloud of smoke that smelled like defeat. That night, Manuel arrived at the house he shared with his mother in Nesa. It was a half-finished 2-story building, like so many others in the neighborhood, with rusty rods sticking out of the roof that promised a 3rd floor that would never come. Doña Rosa was sitting in her plastic chair in the small courtyard, peeling potatoes for dinner. What's wrong, son? She asked immediately when she saw his face. I know you. Did you bring anything? Manuel couldn't lie to his mother. He never had been able to. Mr. Ramirez gave me a week to pay him 3 months' rent, or he'll kick me out of the workshop. Doña Rosa's hand stopped over the potatoes. She was a small woman, bent over by age and diabetes, but her eyes were still as sharp as when she was young and raising 3 children on her own after her first husband abandoned them. How much is it? 15,000. Doña Rosa did some mental arithmetic, the kind of arithmetic that poor mothers do, who know exactly how much each tortilla costs, each kilo of beans, every peso that comes in and goes out of the house. I have 3,000 saved up. She said, it was for my medicine, but no, Mom. Manuel knelt down beside her. Don't even think about it. You need your medicine, and you need your workshop, Manuel. Doña Rosa's voice broke. It's the only thing your father left you. You can't lose it. Manuel hugged his mother, feeling how fragile she had become, how much the responsibility of caring for her weighed on him. That night, he didn't sleep, doing calculations that didn't add up, looking for solutions that didn't exist. Tuesday brought more problems. A customer, Mr. Dominguez, arrived complaining that the work Manuel had done on his car was not done properly. It wasn't true. Manuel knew he had done an impeccable job, but the man shouted and threatened to sue, to tell the newspaper that there was a crooked mechanic in the neighborhood. Manuel ended up giving him back the money he so desperately needed, just to prevent him from ruining what little reputation he had. On Wednesday, Tsutsuru finally gave up. The engine, which had lasted so many years, so many miles, decided it had had enough. Manuel spent the whole afternoon trying to revive it, but it was no use. He needed parts he couldn't afford. His only means of transportation, his work tool, was dead. On Thursday, Doña Rosa fainted in the kitchen. Manuel found her lying next to the stove, pale and sweating cold. He carried her to the Social Security clinic, where they waited 4 hours for a doctor to tell them what Manuel already knew. Her sugar level was dangerously high. She needed medication urgently. Medication that cost 800 pesos and that Manuel did not have. On Friday, Manuel sold his most valuable tools, the ones that had belonged to his father, to a moneylender who gave him a pittance for them. With that money, he bought his mother's medication and some food. He had 2 days to come up with 15,000 pesos, and he had no idea how he was going to do it. That night, sitting in his empty workshop because he didn't even have any work to do, Manuel cried for the first time since his father had died. He cried out of helplessness, out of injustice, out of feeling so small in a world that seemed designed to crush people like him. He looked at the makeshift altar he had in a corner of the workshop with the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe in his father's photo. "What do I do, boss?" he asked the photo. "I don't know what else to do." The photo didn't answer, of course, just looked at him with that smile that Manuel remembered so well. That smile that said everything would be all right, even though nothing was all right. Saturday dawned gray, as if even the sky were mourning Manuel's life. He was sweeping the workshop, mentally preparing himself to talk to Mr. Ramirez and beg for more time that he knew he wouldn't get, when he heard the sound of a car stopping outside. A car with an engine that sounded expensive, smooth, well cared for. Manuel went outside and froze. It was a shiny black Mercedes-Benz in the gray morning light. The driver's door opened and Julia Echeverria Ignacio got out. But she was not the same soaked and desperate woman he had picked up 5 days earlier. This Julia was wearing an impeccable beige suit, her hair perfectly styled, discreet but elegant makeup, and sunglasses that probably cost more than everything Manuel owned. Manuel forgot to breathe for a second. "Manuel," she asked, removing her sunglasses. "Senora Julia." Manuel wiped his hands on his dirty overalls, suddenly feeling very self-conscious about his appearance. The grease stains, the smell of sweat and burnt oil. "I didn't think you'd know where to find me." Julia smiled, and it was a strange smile, full of something Manuel couldn't quite figure out. "It wasn't easy," she admitted. "I had to hire someone to track down old red Zuros in this area. I asked around at gas stations until someone told me they knew a mechanic who drove one like this." Manuel didn't know what to say. Julia looked at him with an intensity that made him feel naked. "Your mother?" he finally asked. "How is she?" Julia's face immediately softened. "She's alive thanks to you," she said in an emotional voice. "The doctor said that if I had arrived 10 minutes later, Manuel, you saved my mother's life." Manuel felt a huge weight lift from his chest, a weight he didn't even know he was carrying. "I'm so glad, Mrs. Julia, there really was a silence." Julia looked around the workshop, taking in every detail. The peeling walls, the oil-stained floor, the few tools that remained, the poverty evident in every corner. "Manuel, I came to thank you," she finally said, "and to pay you for taking me to the hospital." "No, ma'am, you don't have to," she interrupted him firmly. "You helped me when I needed it most, when I was completely vulnerable. Let me repay you, even if it's just a little." She took an envelope out of her bag. Manuel saw that it was thick, clearly full of money. His first instinct was to refuse it. His pride screamed at him not to accept charity. But then he thought of his mother, of the medicine, of the $15,000 pesos he needed in 2 days. "Miss Julia, open it," she insisted, holding out the envelope. Manuel took the envelope with trembling hands and opened it. Inside were 21,000 peso bills, 20,000 pesos. Manuel felt his legs buckle. "Ma'am, this is too much. I just took you to the hospital. I didn't do anything." "You did everything," Julia said, her voice breaking slightly. "Manuel, I was coming from a business meeting that night. I had closed a contract worth several million pesos. I felt powerful, successful, invincible. And then my car broke down, my phone died, and I realized that all that power meant nothing. The cars passing by were driven by successful people, people like me, and none of them stopped. Not one. And then you came along in your old car, tired after a long day, without money, and you didn't hesitate for a second to help me. Tears were running down Julia's cheeks now, although her voice remained steady. Do you know what my mother said when I told her about you? She said I had met an angel, and she was right, Manuel. You saved me not only from the storm, you saved me from becoming the kind of person who doesn't stop. Manuel didn't know what to say. The words stuck in his throat. He looked at the 20,000 pesos in his hands and felt like he was dreaming. Thank you, was all he could say. Thank you, Mrs. Julia. She smiled and put her sunglasses back on. No, thank you, Manuel Colón de la Vega, she said, for reminding me that there is still kindness in this world. Julia got into her Mercedes, but before closing the door, she turned around one last time. And Manuel, if you ever need anything, anything at all, here's my card. She handed him an elegant ivory business card. Call me, seriously. Manuel took the card. It read Julia Echeverria Ignacio, CEO, Echeverria Industrial Group. It meant nothing to him, just an elegant name on expensive paper. He watched the Mercedes drive away until it disappeared into the morning traffic. He stood in the middle of the workshop with 20,000 pesos in one hand and a business card in the other, feeling that he had unwittingly crossed some kind of invisible border between the before and after of his life. That afternoon, he paid his overdue rent, bought a month's worth of medicine for his mother, and still had money left over to buy the parts he needed to repair his Tsuru. Doña Rosa cried when Manuel told her what had happened. You see, son, she said as she hugged him, God never abandons the good. Never. Manuel wanted to believe it. That night, for the first time in weeks, he slept without the anguish tightening his chest. But in his dreams, he kept seeing Julia Echeverria Ignacio's honey-colored eyes. And there was something in them that he hadn't fully understood. Something that told him that this story was just beginning. 3 weeks had passed since Julia's visit, and Manuel's life had returned to its usual rhythm. The workshop had customers again. His mother was more stable with her treatment, and the red Tsuru roared again with its rebuilt engine. Manuel kept Julia's business card in his wallet, but he never used it. He wouldn't know what to say to her. Besides, people like her and people like him lived in such different worlds that their encounter in the storm seemed more and more like a strange dream. It was a Wednesday afternoon when everything changed. Once again, Manuel was adjusting the brakes on a Platinum. When he heard several cars pulling up outside, he looked out and felt his heart skip a beat. It wasn't just Julia's black Mercedes. There were 2 other cars just as elegant as Julia's Mercedes. But she wasn't alone. She was accompanied by an older man in an impeccable suit carrying a leather briefcase. Manuel greeted Julia. There was something different in her tone, something formal, but urgent. I need to talk to you. Do you have a few minutes? Of course, Miss Julia. Manuel wiped his hands and invited them into the small space that served as his office. In reality, it was just an old desk and 2 plastic chairs. Julia sat down. The man in the suit remained standing. There was a tension in the air that Manuel didn't understand. Manuel, I'll be honest with you, Julia began, her voice trembling slightly. I didn't come 3 weeks ago just to thank you and give you that money. I also came because I needed to meet you, to see you, to confirm something. Manuel looked at her without understanding. Confirm what, ma'am? Julia took a deep breath, as if she were about to jump off a cliff. Manuel, your father's name was Roberto Colón Mendez. Manuel's world came to a screeching halt. It had been years since anyone had mentioned his father's full name. Yes, he replied hoarsely. How do you know? And he worked in the 1990s for a trucking company called Transportes Industriales del Norte. Manuel felt the floor moving beneath his feet. Yes, he worked there as a mechanic until the company closed. But I don't understand how Julia put her hand to her mouth, her eyes filled with tears. The man in the suit opened his briefcase and took out several documents. Manuel, Julia said in a broken voice, Transportes Industriales del Norte belonged to my family. My father, Gustavo Echeverria, was the owner. The company closed in 1998 due to financial problems that were my fault. Manuel listened, but he couldn't process the words properly. I was 20 years old, Julia continued. I was in charge of finances because I wanted to prove to my father that I could run the business. I made terrible investments, lost millions, and when everything collapsed, my father had to close the company. 120 families lost their jobs overnight, including his father. The silence that followed was so heavy it hurt. Manuel remembered that time when his father came home with the news that he no longer had a job, how he searched for work for months without success, how he finally had to sell everything they had to open that small workshop that never really prospered, how the pressure and stress probably contributed to the heart attack that took him 8 years later. My father fell into depression after that. Julia was crying openly now. He couldn't live with the guilt of having destroyed his company and the lives of so many people. He committed suicide 2 years later, and I have lived with that guilt ever since. I rebuilt the family empire. I created the Echeverria Industrial Group. I became one of the most successful businesswomen in the country, but none of that erased what I had done. Manuel didn't know what to feel. Anger, pain, understanding. Everything was mixed up in his chest like a hurricane. "And why are you telling me this now?" he finally asked. "Because when I got home, after you saved me, after the son of man whose life I ruined helped me without knowing who I was, I couldn't go on living with this." Julia leaned forward. "Manuel, for 20 years, my legal team has been trying to find all the employees who lost their jobs when I closed Northern Transport. We found some of them, compensated them, helped them, but many others disappeared, moved away, changed their names, or died like your father." The man in the suit placed a document in front of Manuel. "Your father was entitled to a severance payment of 300,000 pesos plus interest when he closed the company," he said in a professional voice. "Due to bankruptcy, he was never able to collect it. This amount, with interest accrued over 26 years plus additional compensation for damages, totals at 800,000. Manuel read the numbers, but he didn't understand them. It couldn't be real. "I can't accept this," he said automatically, his pride resisting. "I don't want your pity or your—" "It's not pity," Julia interrupted him firmly. "It's a debt, Manuel. A debt that should have been paid more than 20 years ago. Your father earned that money with his work, with his sweat. This money is his, and now it's yours. But 2 million is less than what your father deserved." Julia wiped away her tears. "Manuel, I destroyed your family's stability because of my fault and my incompetence. Your father had to start from scratch, work 3 times as hard, live with stress that probably contributed to his early death. 2 million doesn't make up for a life, but it's the least I can do." Manuel looked at the document, the figures representing more money than he had ever seen in his entire life. He thought of his father, how he died young, tired, never having seen the prosperity he deserved. He thought of his mother, living on the bare minimum, battling diabetes, unable to afford the best treatments. He thought of himself, trapped in a cycle of poverty he couldn't escape, no matter how hard he worked. Furthermore, Julia continued in her softest voice, "Now I have a proposal. Grupo Echeverria has contracts with dozens of trucking companies and commercial fleets. They need constant maintenance for hundreds of vehicles. I want you to be our official mechanical service provider." Manuel looked up sharply. "Miss Julia, I only have a small workshop. I don't have the capacity for that." She smiled. "I'm going to offer you an interest-free loan to expand your workshop. Hire staff, buy equipment. The contracts I'll get you will guarantee you steady work for years. And this isn't charity, Manuel, it's business. My partners have told me that you're the best mechanic in the area, that you do impeccable work, that you're honest. I need people like that on my team." Manuel's head was spinning. It was too much, too fast. "Why?" he asked. "Why are you doing all this?" "Just because I helped you that night." Julia shook her head. "I'm doing this because you taught me something I had forgotten 20 years ago." She said in a firm voice, "You taught me that kindness exists, that there are people who help without expecting anything in return, that the value of a human being is not in their bank account, but in their heart." Manuel, when I ruined those 120 families, I became someone who only saw numbers on spreadsheets. It took the tragedy of losing my father to realize that behind every number there was a family. There were dreams. There were real lives. He stood up and extended his hand. "Let me pay you what your family deserves. Let me help you build the business your father dreamed of, and let me, even if only a little, make amends for the biggest mistake of my life." Manuel looked at that outstretched hand. He thought of his father on those nights when he came home exhausted, but always found the strength to teach Manuel how to repair an engine, how to treat customers with respect, how to do things right even when no one was watching. He thought of all the times his father had told him that honesty and hard work would eventually bring rewards. Maybe his father was right after all. Manuel shook Julia Echeverria Ignacio's hand. "I accept," he said simply. Julia smiled, and it was the most genuine smile Manuel had ever seen on her face. The following months were a whirlwind of changes that Manuel could barely process. With the settlement money, he paid off all the debts he had been carrying for years. He bought a complete medical treatment for his mother, which dramatically improved her condition, and they moved to a small but decent house in a better neighborhood. But the most incredible thing was what happened with the workshop. Julia kept every promise. Contracts came in one after another. Trucking companies, companies with fleets of cars, even the government agencies. Manuel had to expand the workshop, renting the space next door and then the next. He hired 5 mechanics, then 10. He bought professional equipment, computerized diagnostic tools, hydraulic lifts. The small workshop in the Morelos neighborhood was transformed into Talleres Colon, a prosperous and respected business. But Manuel never forgot where he came from. Every employee he hired was from the neighborhood. Young people who needed an opportunity, just as he had needed one. He paid them well and taught them the trade with the same patience his father had shown him. And he always reserved Wednesday afternoons to do free work for people who couldn't pay, because he remembered all too well what it was like to need help and have nowhere to turn. Julia became more than just a customer or a benefactor. She became a friend, a confidant. She visited the workshop often, sometimes to review contracts, sometimes just to chat. Doña Rosa adored her and treated her like another daughter. And Julia's mother, Doña Carmen, who had survived the accident thanks to Manuel taking her to the hospital in time, became inseparable friends with Doña Rosa. The two old ladies spent entire afternoons drinking coffee and sharing stories. One afternoon in December, almost exactly a year after that rainy night, Julia arrived at the workshop with her mother. They brought a huge cake and decorations. Manuel looked at them confused. "What's all this?" "It's the anniversary," Julia said with a smile. "A year since a poor mechanic stopped in the rain to help a stranger." They called all the employees. Doña Rosa closed the workshop early and celebrated while cutting the cake. Julia asked for silence. "I want to say something," she announced. "A year ago, I was a successful but empty woman. I had built an empire, but I had lost my soul in the process. And then my car broke down in the middle of a storm, and a man who didn't know me, who had no reason to help me, stopped." She looked directly at Manuel. "Manuel, you didn't just save me that night. You saved me from becoming someone I didn't want to be. You reminded me why I built this empire in the first place, not to accumulate money, but to be able to help others, to make up for past mistakes, to make the world a little better place." She took an envelope out of her bag. "That's why I want to offer you something else. The deeds to this land where the workshop now stands are yours, with no debts, no rent. And I also want to make you a minority partner in 3 of my trucking companies. Not because I owe you more, but because I trust you, because you're the kind of person I want to be part of my legacy." Manuel felt tears running down his cheeks, unable to stop them. Everyone in the workshop applauded. Doña Rosa cried openly, hugging Doña Carmen that night. When everyone left and Manuel closed the workshop, he stood outside looking at the illuminated sign that read, "Talleres Colon, Trusted Service." He thought of his father, how proud he would have been to see what his son had built. He thought of that rainy night when he had been on the verge of not stopping, when he had been so tired and so broken that helping seemed impossible. He took out his phone and called Julia. "Manuel," she answered. "Everything's fine," he said. "I just wanted to thank you for everything, but above all for teaching me that doing the right thing is always worth it, even when it doesn't seem to make sense at the time." Julia laughed softly on the other end of the line. "I should say the same thing, Manuel. You were the one who taught me that first." They hung up. Manuel got into his red Suru, which he still drove, even though he could now buy any car he wanted. He had received offers from collectors who wanted to buy it from him, but he always refused. This car had belonged to his father, and he had driven it that night to save Julia. It was part of his history. As he drove home, a soft rain began to fall, not like last year's storm, but a quiet rain that cleaned the streets and made the city lights shine. Manuel smiled. The rain no longer scared him. The rain reminded him that in the darkest moments, when all seems lost, a simple act of kindness can change not only your life, but the lives of everyone around you. 5 more years passed. Talleres Colon had become a chain of 12 workshops throughout Mexico City, employing more than 150 people. All of them were young people from working-class neighborhoods who needed an opportunity. Manuel no longer worked with his hands under cars. He was now the CEO, but he never lost his simplicity. He continued to visit each workshop, knew every employee by name, and still reserved Wednesdays to personally attend to customers who could not pay. Grupo Echeverria also continued to grow, but under Julia's leadership, it had changed. It was no longer just a company seeking profits, but had implemented social programs, scholarships for employees' children, and a compensation fund for the families of all those employees who had lost their jobs when Transporte del Norte closed 26 years ago. They had managed to locate and compensate 87 of the 120 families affected. One afternoon in March, Manuel received a call that left him frozen. It was the hospital. Doña Rosa had suffered a stroke. By the time Manuel arrived, the doctors had already done everything they could. His mother was in intensive care, hooked up to machines but conscious. Manuel entered the room. He took her frail hand. "Son," she whispered with difficulty. "Don't cry, Mom. Don't say that. You're going to be fine." The doctor said, "Manuel," she interrupted him with that firmness that only mothers have. "I've lived a good life. I saw my son become a good man, someone who helps others, someone who honors his father's name. What more could I ask for?" Manuel's tears fell uncontrollably. "I need you, Mom. I still need you." "No, son," she smiled weakly. "You don't need me anymore. You have Julia. You have your business. You have the life your father dreamed of for you. And when I'm gone, I'll be with your dad, and we'll be proud of you, watching us from wherever we are. Mom, promise me something." He squeezed her hand with what little strength he had left. "Promise me you'll stay who you are, that money won't change you, that you'll always help those in need, that you'll remember where you came from." "I promise. I'm Manuel. I promise you." Doña Rosa closed her eyes peacefully. 3 hours later, she passed away quietly, surrounded by Manuel and Julia, who had rushed over as soon as she heard the news. Doña Carmen arrived shortly after and cried for her friend as if she were her own sister. The funeral was attended by a large crowd. The 150 employees of Talleres Colon attended, many with their families. Customers whom Manuel had helped for free over the years came to offer their condolences. People from the neighborhood who had watched Manuel grow up filled the church, and Julia was there the whole time, holding him when he seemed about to break down. That night after the burial, Manuel sat alone in the house that now felt too empty. He looked at old photos, his father repairing the suru, his mother cooking in the humble kitchen that no longer existed. As a child, learning to use a wrench, he heard a knock at the door. It was Julia bringing food. She knew Manuel hadn't eaten anything all day. "You don't have to be alone," she said simply. They sat in the living room eating in silence. After a while, Julia spoke. "Do you know what your mother said to me the last time I spoke to her?" Manuel shook his head. "She told me I was the best thing that had ever happened to her son." Julia smiled sadly. "I told her it was the other way around, that your son had been the best thing that had ever happened to me, and she laughed and said that we were lucky to have found each other." Manuel felt something stir in his chest. For years, he and Julia had been friends, partners, confidants, but there had always been something more there, something unspoken, something they both felt but had never explored because it seemed complicated, because they came from different worlds, because there was a debt involved that made anything romantic feel inappropriate. "Julia," Manuel said slowly, "you believe in destiny." She thought about it for a moment. She didn't usually believe, she admitted, but after everything that happened, how your father worked for my company, how I ruined his life without knowing it, how years later my car broke down on that very road where you were passing by, how of all the cars that passed that day, the only one that stopped was yours. It would be very arrogant of me not to believe in something bigger. Manuel nodded. My dad used to say that there are no coincidences, only connections we don't yet understand. They fell silent, but it was a comfortable silence. Two people who understand each other without words. Julia took Manuel's hand. We're going to be okay, she said softly. We're both going to be okay. And Manuel knew she was right. Another year passed. Manuel had turned the pain of losing his mother into fuel to help more people. He created the Rosa Colon Foundation, dedicated to providing free medical treatment for people with diabetes in low-income neighborhoods. Julia donated half of the initial capital and helped find more sponsors. They saved hundreds of lives in the first year. One afternoon in November, Manuel was driving his Tsuru through the city when it started to rain. It was a sudden, violent rain that brought back immediate memories of that night 7 years ago. Instinctively, he slowed down and then saw a young woman, no more than 20 years old, standing next to a broken-down car, waving desperately as cars drove by without stopping. Manuel smiled. Without thinking twice, he pulled over and rolled down the window. You need help, miss. The girl ran toward him, soaked and frightened. My car broke down and my phone has no signal. I need to get to work or they'll fire me. Please get in, said Manuel. I'll take you. As the young woman gratefully climbed into the truck, Manuel thought of his father, his mother, Julia, and how far he had come since that rainy night. He thought about how a simple act of kindness had triggered a series of events that transformed his life and the lives of hundreds of people around him. Thank you, sir, said the young woman. You don't know how grateful I am. You're welcome, replied Manuel, starting the Tsuru. I'm just doing what anyone should do as he drove through the rain, taking a stranger to her destination. Manuel finally understood the lesson his father had tried to teach him all his life. That true wealth is not measured in money, but in the number of lives you touch. That true happiness is not in what you accumulate, but in what you give. And that success is not defined by how high you climb, but by how many hands you extend to help others climb with you. 2 weeks later, that same young woman showed up at Talleres Colon asking for Manuel. She brought a homemade cake she had baked herself as a thank you. Manuel invited her in, and they talked. It turned out she was a mechanical engineering student. She worked nights to pay for her studies. Manuel offered her a job at one of his workshops with flexible hours that would allow her to continue her studies and a full scholarship to finish her degree. Why are you doing this? She asked with tears in her eyes. Manuel smiled. Because 7 years ago, someone decided to help me when I needed it most. And I learned that kindness is not a coin that is spent. It is a seed that multiplies every time you plant it. That night, Manuel had dinner with Julia at an elegant restaurant. It was no longer strange for them to go out together. In fact, they were doing it more and more often. Something had changed between them since Doña Rosa's death. A new closeness, an emotional intimacy that neither of them could resist anymore. You helped someone else today, Julia said. It wasn't a question, but a statement. She knew him too well. A girl who got stuck in the rain. Manuel smiled. She reminded me of someone. Julia laughed. You're always picking people up in the rain, aren't you? Always, Manuel confirmed, because you never know. Maybe I'm picking up the next owner of a business empire that's going to change the world. Or maybe, Julia said softly, taking his hand on the table, you're just being the extraordinary person you've always been. Manuel squeezed her hand. There was something he had wanted to say to her for months, but the words never seemed right. But that night, with the rain beating against the restaurant windows, with 7 years of shared history between them, the words finally came. Julia, I know we come from very different worlds, that our story began in a complicated way. But Manuel, she interrupted him, you're going to ask me what I think you're going to ask me. It depends. Manuel smiled nervously. What do you think I'm going to ask you? I hope you ask me if I want to spend the rest of my life with you, she replied with a smile that lit up her face. Manuel felt his heart leap out of his chest. Then yes, I am going to ask you that. He took a small book out of his pocket. It's not an expensive ring like the ones you're probably used to seeing, but it's honest, like everything between us. He opened the box. Inside was a simple silver ring with a small emerald, the color of hope. Julia Echeverria Ignacio, Manuel said with a trembling voice. Would you like to marry a mechanic who drives an old Tsuru and who will always stop to help strangers in the rain? Julia had tears running down her cheeks. I would love to marry the most noble man I have ever known. The man who saved me, not only from a storm, but from myself. The man who taught me that true wealth lies in the heart and not in the bank account. Manuel put the ring on her finger. The people in the restaurant began to applaud, although neither of them really heard them. They kissed while it continued to rain outside, a rain that no longer represented fear or despair, but renewal and new beginnings. They were married 6 months later in a simple but beautiful ceremony. There was no ostentation or excessive luxury, even though Julia could have afforded a $1 million wedding. Instead, they donated what would have been the wedding budget to the Rosa Colon Foundation and a scholarship program for young mechanics from low-income families. The ceremony was held in the same church where Doña Rosa's funeral had been held. The guests were the employees of Talleres Colon, friends from the neighborhood, some customers who had become family, and, of course, Doña Carmen, Julia's mother, who cried with happiness throughout the ceremony. Manuel drove his red Suru decorated with ribbons to the reception. Julia sat beside him, radiant in an elegant but unostentatious white dress, laughing when the engine coughed at a traffic light. "Are you sure you don't want to buy a new car?" she joked. "Never," Manuel replied. "This Suru will take us wherever we need to go. It always has." The reception was held in the courtyard of the original workshop, where it had all begun. They had decorated it with lights and flowers. There was mariachi music and delicious food prepared by the neighborhood women. There were no white-gloved waiters or French champagne, but there was something much more valuable. There was genuine love, real joy, people celebrating, because two people who had found each other in the most unlikely way had decided to walk the rest of the way together during the dance. Julia whispered in Manuel's ear, "Do you think your mom would be proud?" "I know she is," Manuel replied. "She and my dad are here with us. I'm sorry." They danced under the lights while their employees, their friends, their family built with love and not blood watched them with genuine smiles. And when the party was over and everyone had left, Manuel and Julia were left alone in the workshop, sitting on the hood of the Tsuru, looking at the stars that were now visible in the clear sky. "7 years ago," Manuel said, "if you had told me that I would end up married to the most incredible woman in the world, owning a successful chain of workshops and changing lives the way we do now, I would have thought you were crazy." "7 years ago," Julia replied, "if someone had told me that a poor mechanic in an old car was going to teach me more about life, success, and happiness than all my millions combined, I would have thought it was impossible." And yet Manuel kissed her softly. "Here we are. Here we are," Julia smiled. "And I wouldn't change a thing, not even that storm, not even the mistakes of the past, because all of that brought us to this moment." They sat there on the hood of the Suru until the sky began to lighten with the first rays of dawn. A new day was beginning, full of possibilities, full of hope, full of the promise that when you do good, good eventually finds its way back to you. Manuel Colon de la Vega, the mechanic who stopped in the rain to help a stranger, never imagined that that simple act of kindness would change his life forever. But that's how the universe works. Good deeds are rarely rewarded immediately, but they always, always have consequences that, if you're lucky, are more beautiful than you ever dared to dream. Years later, when Manuel and Julia were older, when Talleres Colon had become a national company employing thousands of people, when the Rosa Colon Foundation had saved tens of thousands of lives, they were asked in interviews what the secret of their success was. They always answered the same thing: there is no secret, only kindness, hard work, humility, and the willingness to stop when someone needs you. Even when it's inconvenient, even when you're tired, even when you have nothing to give, because you never know when that act of compassion will change not only the life of the person you help, but your own life in ways you can't imagine. And every time it rained, Manuel still drove his old red Suru through the streets, searching, always searching for someone who needed help, because he had learned that the purpose of life is not to accumulate wealth, but to multiply kindness. And that the true legacy we leave behind is not in what we build for ourselves, but in how many lives we touch with love, compassion, and generosity. The Tsuru finally died when Manuel was 62, but instead of scrapping it, they completely restored it and put it on permanent display at the entrance to the first Cologne workshop with a plaque that read, This car taught us that the value of a vehicle is not in its price, but in the places it takes you and the lives it touches along the way. 1992 to 2025. Never forgotten, always honored. And every new employee who joined Talleres Cologne heard the story of that red Zuru, of a rainy night, of a poor mechanic with a heart of gold, and of how a simple act of kindness sparked a wave of transformation that touched thousands of lives and built a legacy of love, compassion, and hope that would last for generations. Because in the end, that's the real story. We are never so broken that we cannot give. We are never so tired that we cannot help. And we never know when the simple act of stopping for someone in need will change the world, starting with our own. Yeah.